He said it before she had finished unpinning her hair. I will not pretend to love you. Grace Darrow, Grace Prescott now, as of 11 o'clock that morning, Duchess of Harrogate, as of the moment the register was signed and the ink dried and the chapel doors opened onto a future neither of them had chosen, stood at the dressing table in the bedchamber that was now hers and looked at her husband's reflection in the mirror. He was standing by the door. He had removed his coat but not his waistcoat, and he held himself with the rigid composure of a man delivering a speech he had rehearsed, shoulders set, chin level, hands clasped behind his back, in the posture she would later learn he adopted in the House of Lords when he was about to say something he believed to be necessary and expected to be unpopular. Richard Prescott, 7th Duke of Harrogate, was 33 years old. He had a jaw that looked as though it had been designed for clenching and eyes that were dark and serious and gave nothing away. He was not handsome in the way that London understood handsome. He was too angular, too severe, too much the product of stone houses and northern moors to pass for the kind of man who was admired at balls. He was handsome in the way that a well-built wall is handsome, functional, unyielding, and unlikely to collapse under pressure. He was also, at this moment, being more honest than any man had been with her in her entire life. I married you because your father's shipping interests align with the estate's need for a reliable export route for our wool, he continued in the same measured tone. And because my mother, before she died, made me promise I would marry before I turned 35, and I am running out of time. You are intelligent, you are sensible, and your father's solicitor drew reasonable terms. I respect you. I believe we can build something workable, but I will not stand in this room and perform a feeling I do not have. I think you deserve better than performance. Grace set down the hairpin she had been holding. She turned on the stool to face him. She looked at him for a long moment, at the rigid shoulders and the clenched jaw and the dark eyes that were watching her with the particular intensity of a man who expected to be hated for what he had just said and was prepared to accept it. Good, she said. Neither will I. His expression did not change, but something behind it shifted, a flicker in the eyes, a fractional loosening of the jaw, the response of a man who had braced for impact and found, instead, that the ground beneath his feet was steadier than he had expected. You are not offended, he said. I am relieved. She folded her hands in her lap. I have spent the past 6 weeks preparing for this marriage with the knowledge that it was a business arrangement dressed in white silk. My father needs your land routes. Your estate needs his ships. I am the clause in the contract that makes the arrangement respectable. I understood this when I accepted, and I accepted because the alternative was to refuse and watch my father's business collapse, which would have taken my mother and my 2 younger brothers with it. She paused. The candles on the dressing table flickered in a draft from the window. The November wind, finding the gaps in the casement that she would later discover, ran throughout the house, because Harrogate was a 300-year-old building that had been built for grandeur rather than warmth. So no, she said, I will not pretend either. I do not love you. I do not know you. What I know is that you are direct, which I value, and that you have chosen honesty over comfort on our wedding night, which tells me more about your character than 6 weeks of courtship managed. If we are to build something, I would rather build it on this than on a lie we would both have to maintain. The silence in the bedchamber was not empty. It was full of the thing that neither of them had expected to find in this room, the sudden, startling relief of 2 people who had been carrying the same secret and had just discovered they were not carrying it alone. I had prepared myself to be kind about it, Richard said. I had a whole speech about how affection sometimes grows with time. Was it a good speech? It was terrible. I practiced it in the carriage. Grace felt something happen at the corner of her mouth. Not a smile, not yet, but the structural possibility of one. I practiced one too, she said, about being patient and understanding and trusting that mutual respect was a foundation for deeper feeling. Was yours better than mine? It was appalling. My mother helped me write it. He almost smiled. Not quite. The jaw was still too set, the posture still too rigid, but the architecture was there, in the same way that the architecture of a house is visible before the house is finished. You can see what it will become, even if it is not yet inhabitable. Then we are agreed, he said. No pretending. No pretending. I will not come to your bed tonight. I think we should learn the shape of this arrangement first. I agree. He inclined his head. He picked up his coat from the chair where he had laid it. He walked to the connecting door between their chambers, a heavy oak door with iron hinges that had separated dukes and duchesses of Harrogate for 3 centuries, and he paused with his hand on the handle. "Grace," he said. It was the first time he had used her Christian name since the ceremony. "Thank you for not making me feel worse about this than I already do." "You feel badly about it?" "I feel badly that you deserved a man who loved you on his wedding night, and instead you got a man who can offer you a wool export route and an honest conversation. It is not what you should have had." "It is," she said, "the first honest conversation I have had with a man in 24 years. It may be more than you think." He looked at her for a moment. Then he opened the door and went through it and closed it behind him, and Grace sat at the dressing table in the candlelight and listened to the November wind finding every gap in the casement and thought, "This is not what I expected. It might be better." The first weeks were careful. They breakfasted together, he at the head of the table, she at the foot, the length of polished oak between them serving as both literal and metaphorical distance. He ate methodically. She ate with the absent efficiency of a woman whose mind was always 3 steps ahead of her fork. They discussed the household, the estate, the matters that required her attention as the new duchess. They did not discuss what they had said on their wedding night. They did not need to. The honesty of that conversation had established the terms, and the terms were clear. They were partners in an enterprise, and the enterprise was Harrogate, and the feelings, or the absence of feelings, were not relevant to the operation. Grace had been raised to understand enterprises. She understood this one. What she did not understand in those first weeks was the house itself. Harrogate was not like any building she had known. Her father's house in Hull was practical, brick, well heated, designed by a man who believed that houses existed to keep weather out and people in. Harrogate existed for other reasons entirely. It had been built in the 16th century by a duke who believed that grandeur was a moral statement, expanded in the 17th by a duke who believed that grandeur was insufficient without symmetry, and neglected in the 18th by a duke who believed that London was more interesting than the country, and had let the East Wing develop a lean that the estate architect described, with studied understatement, as characterful. Grace walked every corridor. She opened every door. She stood in rooms that had not been entered in years and noted the state of the plaster and the quality of the light and the particular smell of a space that has been closed for so long that it has forgotten what air is. She carried a notebook, a plain leather-bound book she had bought in Hull before the wedding, and she wrote down everything: the number of rooms, the condition of the windows, the name of every servant and their role and how long they had been employed, and whether they appeared, in her assessment, to be competent or merely present. Mrs. Hewitt, the housekeeper, was a woman of 55 who had served the Harrogate household for 21 years and who treated the arrival of a new duchess the way a general treats the arrival of a new commanding officer, with professional deference and private assessment. She showed Grace the house, room by room, corridor by corridor, from the grand reception rooms that hadn't been opened since the old Duke's funeral to the attic storerooms where 3 generations of furniture sat beneath dust sheets like ghosts waiting to be summoned. On the 3rd day, Grace found the accounts room. It was a small chamber off the steward's office, lined with shelves that held 30 years of ledgers, and she sat down at the desk and began reading them from the most recent year backward. She read for 4 hours, when Mrs. Hewitt found her, having searched the house with increasing concern because new duchesses did not typically vanish into the accounts room. Grace looked up and said, "The pineapple subscription has been running for 9 years. Who ordered it?" Mrs. Hewitt looked at her with the expression of a woman whose initial assessment was undergoing significant revision. "The previous Duke, Your Grace. He had a fondness for exotic fruit. The previous Duke has been dead for 8 years. "Yes, Your Grace. And the pineapple has continued to arrive." "Yes, Your Grace. Does anyone eat it?" "No, Your Grace. The kitchen staff make a compote that no one requests. The remainder goes to the pigs." Grace made a note in her leather book. "The pigs," she said, "have been living better than the Eastern tenants." She turned back to the ledgers. Mrs. Hewitt withdrew. That evening, she said to the cook, with the careful neutrality of a woman who did not give opinions but merely shared observations, she found the pineapple. The cook, who had been making unwanted pineapple compote for 9 years, closed her eyes and said, "Thank God." Grace absorbed it all. She had been raised in a merchant's household. Her father, Mr. Jonas Darrow, had built a shipping company from a single vessel to a fleet of 14, and she had grown up understanding that every enterprise, whether it transported wool across the North Sea or managed 300 years of accumulated silver, operated on the same principles. Know what you have, know what it costs, and know where the inefficiencies are hiding. She found them quickly. Harrogate had been run by men for a decade. The old Duke had been widowed young and never remarried, and Richard had inherited at 25 and managed the estate with Marsden the steward, and Mrs. Hewitt and a bachelor's indifference to domestic detail. The result was a house that functioned but did not thrive. The linens had not been inventoried in 4 years. The kitchen accounts showed a steady increase in expenditure with no corresponding improvement in quality. The tenants' cottages on the eastern boundary needed repairs that Marsden had noted in the ledger, but not actioned, because no one had told him to action them. Grace actioned them. She did it quietly, without fanfare, with the matter-of-fact competence of a woman who had been watching her father run a business since she was old enough to sit on his knee during meetings. She revised the kitchen accounts and found a butcher in the village who charged less than the one in York. She organized the linen inventory and discovered that the house owned 47 sets of bed sheets, 11 of which had not been used since the Napoleonic Wars. She wrote to the tenants on the eastern boundary personally, in her own hand, explaining that the repairs would begin before Christmas. Marsden, when he learned about the letters, came to find Richard in the study. He was a man of 40 who had been steward since the old Duke's time, and who operated with the slow, methodical care of someone who believed that efficiency and urgency were incompatible. "The Duchess has written to the tenants," he said. "Has she?" "She has promised repairs before Christmas. I have been planning those repairs for the spring." "Then it appears they will happen sooner than you planned." Marsden opened his mouth, closed it, and left. He did not argue with the Duchess again. He did not need to. Within a month, he had learned what Mrs. Hewitt and the cook and the tenants on the eastern boundary were already discovering, that Grace Prescott did not make promises she could not keep, and that the most efficient response to her decisions was not resistance, but compliance. Richard did not notice immediately. He was in London 3 days a week. The House of Lords was in session, and he sat through every debate with the grim determination of a man who believed that governance was a moral obligation. And when he was at Harrogate, he spent his time in the study with Marsden, reviewing estate accounts and correspondence. It was Mrs. Hewitt who told him. "The Duchess has reorganized the kitchen accounts," she said, standing in the study doorway with the expression of a woman delivering news she was not entirely certain would be welcome. "Has she?" "She has reduced the monthly expenditure by £12 without changing the menu." Richard looked up from his correspondence. £12. "She found a butcher in the village, and she cancelled the standing order for hothouse fruit from York, which no one eats in winter and which has been delivered every week for 9 years because no one told them to stop." "I eat hothouse fruit." "You eat an apple from the orchard, Your Grace. You have never, in my observation, touched the hothouse pineapple." Richard sat back in his chair. He had married a woman for her father's ships and received, apparently, someone who could also identify a 9-year surplus of unwanted pineapple. He was not certain what to do with this information. He found her in the morning room that evening, at the desk she had claimed, a small writing table near the window that had previously held a vase of dried flowers and now held a ledger, a pot of ink, and a stack of correspondence arranged in order of urgency. She was writing a letter. Her hair was pinned loosely, and she had removed her Spencer jacket, and she wore a plain dove gray wool day dress that was well made but unadorned, the dress of a woman who valued function over display. "Mrs. Hewitt tells me you canceled the pineapple," he said. "It was costing 8 shillings a week. No one was eating it." "What did you do with the last one?" "I sent it to the vicar's wife. She was delighted. She had never seen a pineapple." Richard leaned against the doorframe. "You sent a pineapple to the vicar's wife?" "I did. She has invited us to dinner on Thursday in gratitude. I accepted. I hope that's agreeable." "The vicar is a bore." "The vicar's wife is not. She knows every tenant family on the eastern boundary by name, which is more than Marsden does, and she has opinions about the drainage on the lower meadow that I think you should hear." Richard looked at her. this woman he had married for her father's ships, sitting at a desk that had held dried flowers 3 weeks ago, sending pineapples to Vickers' wives and soliciting drainage opinions from women the estate had never thought to consult, and he felt something he had not anticipated. Not attraction, not yet, not affection. It was too early for that. Something closer to curiosity, the dawning awareness that the person sitting across the room was considerably more interesting than the terms of their arrangement had required her to be. "I will come to the Vickers' dinner," he said, "but I reserve the right to leave if he begins talking about his collection of Roman coins." "He will begin talking about his collection of Roman coins. He always does," Mrs. Hewitt warned me. "I have prepared 3 questions about Roman drainage systems that should redirect the conversation toward something useful." "You prepared questions." "I prepare for everything, Your Grace. It is how I was raised." "Richard," he said, "if we are not pretending, we should not pretend to be formal. My name is Richard." She looked at him. The structural possibility of a smile that had appeared on their wedding night completed itself. Not fully, not the broad, open smile that he would later learn was reserved for moments of genuine surprise, but a real one, quiet and precise, the smile of a woman who had been given something she valued, a small, voluntary step toward familiarity. "Richard," she said, "my name is Grace, but you knew that." "I did. I have not used it enough." The Vickers' dinner was precisely as tedious as Richard had predicted, and precisely as useful as Grace had planned. The vicar talked about Roman coins for 11 minutes before Grace deployed her drainage question, which redirected the conversation to the lower meadow, which led to the vicar's wife, a formidable woman named Mrs. Cartwright who had lived in the parish for 30 years, describing in exact detail which cottages leaked, which roofs needed rethatching, and which tenant families were struggling most as winter approached. Richard listened. He had not, he realized, ever listened to the vicar's wife before. He had attended parish dinners as a duty and endured them as a penance and left as soon as courtesy allowed. Grace had turned the same dinner into an intelligence-gathering exercise, and she had done it with a pineapple and 3 prepared questions. In the carriage home, in the dark, with the November wind rattling the windows, he said, "You are very good at this." "At what?" "At making things work, at finding the useful thing inside the tedious thing, at—" he paused, searching for the right word, "at seeing what is actually there instead of what is supposed to be there." Grace was quiet for a moment. The carriage rocked over a rut in the road. "My father taught me," she said. "He built his company from one ship and a borrowed desk. He could not afford to see what was supposed to be there. He had to see what was actually there, and then decide what to do about it. He taught me the same way. He said, 'Grace, the world will show you what it wants you to see. Your job is to see what it is hiding.' He sounds formidable. He is. He is also the reason I am here, in this carriage, married to a duke I do not love, because his ships needed your roots, and your estate needed his fleet, and I am the clause that made it all respectable." She said this without bitterness. She said it the way she said everything, with the clear-eyed directness that he was beginning to understand was not a choice, but a disposition. "But I do not resent it. My father gave me the tools to be useful anywhere. Harrogate is simply the place where I am being useful now. You are more than useful." She turned to look at him in the darkness of the carriage. He could not see her expression, but he could feel the quality of her attention, the focused, unhurried consideration of a woman who weighed words before accepting them. "That," she said, "is the first thing you have said to me that was not strictly accurate, but I appreciate the intention behind it. It was accurate. It was kind. There is a difference." "Not always," he said, and the carriage carried them home through the dark, and neither of them spoke again, but the silence was different from the silence they had shared over the breakfast table. It was not distance, it was proximity. It was the silence of 2 people who had discovered that the space between them was smaller than they had assumed and were not yet certain what to do about it. Christmas came. Grace organized the household celebration with the same systematic competence she brought to everything: the decorations placed, the menu planned, the tenants' gifts assembled and distributed on Christmas Eve, with personal notes in her own hand for each family. She had learned their names, all of them, not just the tenant farmers, but their wives, their children, the ages of the children, the particular needs of each household. Mrs. Mitchell on the eastern boundary was expecting her 4th child in February, and Grace had arranged for the midwife's fee to be covered by the estate. Mr. Hargreaves in the South Cottage had a son who showed promise at reading, and Grace had written to the parish school in the next village about a place. The widow Carmichael, whose husband had died in October and whose roof was the first Grace had ordered repaired, received a basket containing ham, preserves, candles, and a letter in Grace's hand that said simply, "You are not alone. The estate is here. I am here." Marsden, who had been steward for 15 years and still referred to the eastern tenants by their plot numbers, watched her walk through the village on Christmas morning, greeting people by name and carrying a basket of Mrs. Hewitt's mince pies, and he said to Richard, who was walking beside him, "She knows more of them than I do." "She knows more of everything than either of us," Richard said. "It is best to accept it early." That afternoon, they walked together through the grounds. The frost had not yet thawed, and the trees along the drive were skeletal and silver against a pale sky. And the house behind them, gray stone, tall windows, 3 centuries of accumulated grandeur and neglect, looked, for the first time since Richard could remember, like a place that was being inhabited rather than merely occupied. "Your letters to the tenants," he said, "the personal ones, with the notes about their children. What about them?" "My mother did the same thing, before she died. She wrote to every family at Christmas. I found the drafts in her desk after the funeral. I did not continue the practice." "I should have." Grace walked beside him in silence for a moment, their boots crunching on the frozen gravel. "You did not continue it, because you did not know how," she said. "There is no shame in that. You kept the estate solvent and the tenants housed and the roof over their heads. You sat in the House of Lords and voted on laws that affected their livelihoods. You did what you knew how to do. I am doing what I know how to do. Between us, the enterprise is covered." "You keep calling it an enterprise." "It is an enterprise. Marriage, estate, household, they are all enterprises. The only difference between this and my father's shipping company is that the cargo is people's lives instead of wool, and the returns are measured in something other than money." "What are they measured in?" She looked at him. The frost had reddened her cheeks and her breath made small clouds in the cold air, and she was, he thought, beautiful, not in the way that London understood beauty, but in the way that a well-run enterprise was beautiful, efficient, purposeful, and entirely without waste. "I'm still calculating," she said. On Christmas night, after the household had retired, and the candles had burned low, and the house was quiet. In the way that old houses are quiet on winter nights, not silent but settling, the stones and timbers adjusting themselves against the cold. Richard knocked on the connecting door. Grace opened it. She was in her nightgown, her hair down, a shawl around her shoulders, and a book in her hand. She looked at him without surprise, as though she had been expecting the knock but had not known which night it would come. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what you said in the carriage, that the first thing I said to you that was not strictly accurate was that you are more than useful." "I remember. You were wrong. It was accurate. I have spent the past 2 months watching you remake this house. Not dramatically, not loudly, but completely. You found the pineapple. You found the tenants. You found the vicar's wife. You found the gap in the linens and the gap in the kitchen accounts and the gap in Marsden's knowledge of his own tenants. And you filled every one of them without asking for recognition or gratitude or anything at all." Grace stood in the doorway, holding her book and her shawl, and she looked at him with the expression he had seen on their wedding night, the careful assessment, the weighing of words. But there was something else in it now, something that had not been there before, the first evidence of a woman allowing herself to want something she had told herself she did not need. "I did not fill every gap," she said quietly. "Which one remains?" She looked at him. He looked at her. The connecting door stood open between them, the oak and iron barrier that had separated dukes and duchesses for 3 centuries, and on either side of it stood 2 people who had agreed to build something on honesty, and were discovering, with the slow and slightly terrifying clarity of people who have kept their word, that honesty had built something neither of them had planned. "This one," she said. He stepped through the door. The winter passed, then the spring. The connecting door remained open, not symbolically, literally. Grace had asked Marsden to remove the bolt, and when Mrs. Hewitt noticed, she said nothing, but she began setting fresh flowers on both sides of the doorframe each morning, which was Mrs. Hewitt's way of expressing approval without using words. Grace wrote to her father every week. The letters were detailed, practical, affectionate. She reported on the estate's accounts, on the shipping routes that were now operational, on the quality of the wool clip, and the efficiency of the new export arrangements. She did not tell him that she was happy. She told him that the enterprise was sound. Mr. Darrow, who understood his daughter better than anyone alive, read between the lines and said to his wife, "She is happy. She just doesn't know how to say it yet. She'll figure it out. She figures everything out." Her father visited in March. He arrived in a hired carriage. He would not use the Harrogate coaches on principle because he was a merchant, and merchants did not borrow from aristocrats, even aristocrats who happened to be their sons-in-law. And he walked through the house with the assessing eye of a man who evaluated assets for a living. He inspected the wool stores. He examined the shipping manifests. He walked the eastern boundary with Marsden and pointed out 3 things about the drainage that Marsden had not considered and that Grace had already identified and corrected. At dinner, he sat at Richard's table and drank Richard's wine and looked at his daughter, who was discussing the relative merits of overland versus coastal wool transport with the quiet authority of a woman who had mastered the subject. And he said, "You have done well with her." Richard set down his glass. "I have not done anything with her. She has done it herself." Mr. Darrow looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded, a single, firm incline of the head, the gesture of a man who has just revised his assessment of an investment from satisfactory to excellent. And he said, "That is the correct answer." After dinner, when Mr. Darrow had retired to the guest room, Grace found Richard in the study. He was reading correspondence from the Lords. There was a bill on wool tariffs that required his attention, and she sat in the chair opposite the desk, the chair she had claimed in December and that no one else was permitted to sit in, and she said, "My father approves of you." "How can you tell?" "He gave you the nod. He has 3 nods. The first means acceptable. The second means better than expected. The third means—" She paused. "The third is the one he gave my mother when she told him she was carrying my brother. It means the enterprise has exceeded all projections." "Which nod did I receive?" "The third." Richard looked at her across the desk. She looked back at him. And for the first time since their wedding night, neither of them was being careful. Neither of them was measuring the distance or weighing the words or calculating the appropriate level of honesty for the moment. They were simply sitting in a room together, in the easy, unperforming silence of 2 people who had stopped pretending long enough to discover that what remained, when the pretending was removed, was something worth keeping. Richard sat in the House of Lords that spring and listened to a debate on trade regulation and found himself thinking, for the first time, about what Grace would say. She would say that the proposed tariff was designed to protect estates like his at the expense of merchants like her father, and she would say it without rancor, but with data, and she would be right. He voted against the tariff. Lord Pemberton asked him why. "My wife explained the economics," Richard said. "Your wife? She is more qualified to discuss trade policy than anyone in this chamber. If the Lords admitted women, she would have my seat." Pemberton laughed. Richard did not. He had not been joking. Their daughter was born the following autumn, a girl they named after no one, because Grace said she wanted the child to begin without inheritance, even the inheritance of a name. They called her Maren, a name Grace had found in a book of Norse history, because Harrogate was in the north, and the north remembered the old names, and because Grace liked the sound of it, strong and short and unadorned, like everything she valued. Mrs. Hewitt held the baby first after the midwife, which was not protocol but was, by that point, inevitable. Mrs. Hewitt had spent the past year watching Grace transform the house she had served for 21 years, and she had developed for the Duchess a loyalty so fierce that she had personally dismissed 2 of the applicant midwives on grounds that she described as insufficient seriousness. She held Maren, and she said to the baby, in a voice that was intended for Grace, "You will be formidable. It is unavoidable. Mr. Darrow arrived from Hull within 3 days. He held his granddaughter with the careful precision of a man handling valuable cargo and said, "She has your mother's chin and your father's stubbornness and your sense of timing. You were born on the same day I signed the contract with the Rotterdam fleet. I shall consider it a good omen." Grace, who was exhausted and exhilarated and propped against pillows in the bed where 3 centuries of Harrogate children had been born, said, "Everything is an omen to you, Father. Everything is an omen when you pay attention. Your mother taught me that. Your husband is learning it. You have always known." Richard held his daughter in the library on the evening she was born and looked at Grace, who was exhausted and triumphant, and still, even now, watching him with those clear, assessing eyes. And he said, "I need to correct something." "What?" "On our wedding night, I told you I would not pretend to love you. I am not pretending now. I need you to know the difference." Grace looked at him, this angular, severe, unyielding man who had stood by the door of their bedchamber 2 years ago and delivered honesty like a blow, because he did not know how to deliver it any other way, and who had spent every day since then proving that honesty, given room and time and a woman who matched it with her own, could grow into something that neither of them had words for on the night they began. "I know the difference," she said. "I have known for some time." "How long?" "Since the pineapple." He stared at her. "The pineapple. You came to the morning room and you leaned against the doorframe and you asked me about the pineapple, and you looked at me as though I were the most confounding thing you had ever encountered. No one had ever looked at me that way before. My father looks at me with pride. My mother looks at me with worry. You looked at me with curiosity, as though you had opened a ledger expecting columns of numbers and found a novel instead. That is the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me, and it involves a pineapple. I am not a romantic person." "No," he said, holding their daughter, looking at his wife. "You are better than that. You are an honest one." The fire burned. Maren slept. Outside, the November wind found every gap in the casement, the way it had on their wedding night, the way it always would in a house that was 300 years old and built for grandeur rather than warmth. But the house was warm now. Not because the gaps had been sealed. Grace had tried. The stonemason had explained, with the gentle condescension of a man who had been maintaining the building since before she was born, that the gaps were structural and could not be removed without compromising the walls, but because the rooms were occupied by people who had chosen to stay in them, together, without pretending. Mrs. Hewitt, passing the library door on her final round of the evening, heard the Duke laughing and the Duchess saying something about pineapple economics and a baby making the small sounds that babies make when they are held by people who are happy, and she closed the door quietly behind her and went downstairs and told the cook, who was banking the kitchen fire for the night, "The enterprise is sound." The cook, who had not asked and did not understand the reference, said, "Good." Mrs. Hewitt poured herself a small glass of the Duke's port, a liberty she had been taking for 21 years and which no one had ever mentioned, and she drank it standing by the kitchen window, looking out at the November dark. And she thought, it was the pineapple. It was always going to be the pineapple. If this story stayed with you, you might find the next one does too. They arrive here, like an honest word, spoken in a room where no one expected it, whenever they are ready.